Hey guys, it's Em. And today, we're gonna be reviewing Dark Souls 1, the first of the trilogy. Now funnily enough, I never actually intended on reviewing this game. The main reason I wanted to review 2 and 3 was because I played a ton of those games and wanted to talk about them. Dark Souls 1, while I did play it, I played it significantly less than the other 2 in the series. When I initially got the game, I beat it once, then started playing it for a second time and stopped halfway. Now, years later, having reviewed the other 2, I felt I had to review it to finish off the trilogy. So as always, in preparation, I beat the game again, going out of my way to experience almost everything I hadn't before. And let me tell you, this video is going to be an experience for both of us. 2 things before we start. At times I will be comparing things to the other 2 titles. I felt I would be babying this game if I didn't do this, as I feel by itself, it's good enough on its own where I don't need to coddle it by saying for the time before I make any point. Of course I'll give it its for the time credits where they're due, but we live in an age where multiple Dark Souls games now exist, and I'm going to be talking about it from that viewpoint. Second, as I always say, I'm not going to be blindly praising this game or hating it. I'm just here to give my opinion on it, and that's it. Now, with all that being said, let's begin. Dark Souls 1's world is very interesting. Literally every location is visually distinct and memorable in its own ways. If you've played this game, I'm pretty sure you could name these locations the moment you see them. They all have distinct themes to separate themselves from each other, and I quite like that. I didn't even notice how evident it was until my replay for this video. This is a great and pretty much crucial detail, since unlike the other 2, you can't fast travel until the second half of the game, meaning you have to go through these areas multiple times throughout your playthrough. Now some may say this is annoying as you have to waste your time walking through areas you've already been through over and over again. Don't get me wrong, it definitely does feel like that at times, but the trade for that is you really get to appreciate this world and all the ways around it, which is a unique aspect I feel I haven't seen in many other games. The game's world by itself isn't large enough to the point where it feels unmanageable. It's all pretty tightly made, and it won't take you long to remember pathways in and out of these areas. This also helped me notice something else, how valuable shortcuts are. Before I played any Dark Souls game, I had seen some review praising the shortcuts, then I got my hands on 2 and 3 and I didn't even see what was so amazing about them. Sure, they were helpful, but acting like it was some crazy amazing feature felt a bit ridiculous to me. Then you play 1 and it immediately makes sense. As I said, you go through these areas time and time again, so figuring out and finding shortcuts is super valuable to you in your journey. It's rewarding to go through an entire area, unlock the shortcut, then know you can skip a large portion of the map on your way back. It's a very unique feature I've never really seen matter so much in any other game, and it really helps this stand out against the others in the series. You could argue the late game fast travel ruins this game, but I feel like it's introduced at the perfect spot in the playthrough, as this is where the world's really opened up and walking between both ends of the map would be unbearable. Now, do I have some issues with the areas themselves? Some, but they aren't things you haven't heard before. Lost Izalith sucks and it feels like it was made by a toddler, copying and pasting the same enemy over and over again to compensate for the fact that there's nothing there. Blighttown isn't great. When you have it memorized, you can get down it quickly, but if not, it feels like a nightmare. Sen's Fortress, while the least annoying out of the areas I've mentioned so far, it's definitely not a place I love going through due to all its traps and intentionally annoyingly placed enemies. And whoever decided to hide a bonfire near a ledge a normal person wouldn't even look down on their playthrough is genuinely an awful human being. Duke's Archives feels like horde mode at times, and the way to the Great Hollow is stupid, and I'm almost positive you wouldn't figure out how to get into this area without Googling. But even though I don't love those, the few isn't enough to drag down the majority of this game. This is going to be an odd point. Now when I say this, I mean this in an entirely different way than I did in my video for Dark Souls 2. You see, in Dark Souls 1, it feels like they have you in a lot more cutscenes than they did in 2 and 3. Or at least a lot more that directly feature you in shot. There aren't many that don't, and as dumb as it sounds, it's just nice to see your character show up in all these scenes. It helps immerse you in the world. Most of 2's cutscenes, you weren't even in the shot. Despite 3 having the best boss fights and graphics where you'd love to see your character interact with the boss in some sort of way, you're only in shot for like a handful of them, and even in those you're only there for about a few seconds at most. Here, it feels like you really get to see your character make it through this unforgiving world. And as for one little add-on to this point about your character, I really love the animations for when you're under the stat requirement. Watching your character stumble around when swinging the weapon or fumbling it into a block makes you feel a tangible change when your character can use them properly later, or show how out of their element they are when using other weapons outside of the norm. Builds in DS1 are probably the most impactful when compared to 2 and 3. For starters, you can't redo your stats. While this objectively kinda sucks for an RPG, and especially so in the Souls series, since every other game in the trilogy lets you do this, it does lead to your stat choice having a lot more weight, as you can't just undo it if you dislike them. When you get your build focused on one or two things, the creative freedom here is interesting, due to a few aspects. There's a lot less magic in this game in comparison to the other two, due to it being the first, but most magics here tend to be pretty amazing, doing a lot of damage and being able to destroy most normal enemies in one hit, sometimes even multiple enemies. I definitely used it a lot more here than I did in 2 and 3, as even though it feels simpler, it seems a lot more effective. Then to break them down a little bit, let's talk about Pyromancy, Faith, and Sorcery by themselves, because I find them very interesting here. Pyromancy doesn't scale with anything, at all. You just upgrade it with souls and it gets stronger. It doesn't require any specific resource like the Fire Seed in 2 or even Titanite like 3. Now initially I thought it was going to end up sucking because, as I said, it doesn't scale. And most things that don't scale in Souls games tend to be kinda bad. But here it feels like if you keep leveling it, normally it does more than a generous amount of damage. It never really fell behind the rest of my main damage types. If anything, it was slightly above them. And as for Sorcery and Faith, none of the magic catalysts level at all. They just scale off of your stats, which is jarring coming off of 2 and 3. It feels really good to pick up a better catalyst or just level your stats and see an immediate difference in your damage. All three pathways I mentioned are extremely viable, but what about Strength and Dex? Dex feels pretty standard and in line with 2 and 3. Fast, lightweight weapons that usually do bleed or some other status effect. It's strong, but nothing really outside of the norm. Strength, however, kind of feels like easy mode here. If you get a large weapon, you can shart out damage, most likely insta-killing normal enemies and doing crazy damage to bosses. And as we'll get to, bosses aren't exactly lightning fast and can stagger here, meaning you'll be able to beat most of them quickly. Then let's get into equipment load, because it's a very build-defining feature in this game. In 2 and 3, most of the time you can't even tell if you're medium or light roll. They look almost identical, and to most people who haven't looked deep into iframes, you wouldn't be able to tell any difference. In DS1, it's immediately evident what equip load you're at. For those of you who have played the other games, the light roll in DS1 is pretty much the medium roll in the other two games. Your quick snappy roll that will get you out of trouble. The medium roll here is kinda gross feeling. It's functional, but the end lag isn't great. Then there's the heavier fat roll, which if you've played the other games, you know what this is. The chunky roll you shouldn't be using, as you should have a substitute for it, like a shield or high poise. Replaying for this review, I forgot how tangible the difference was between roll types, meaning I had to adjust my build accordingly to which kind of roll I wanted. It does add a little bit of weight management I didn't feel in the other games, and as I said at the start, it really makes you feel like the way you build your character affects a lot about how you play the game. Somewhat similar to DS2, DS1 has a lot of unique features that simply didn't transfer to any of the other games somehow. While not as many, I feel I should point them out. Tail cutting. While it's not necessarily unique to this game, the way it's executed is. Every boss with a tail in this game is able to have it cut off, making it drop some of the most unique weapons in the game. Ignoring the literal weapon reward aspect of this feature, it feels really great to just cut an entire limb off of a boss with a blood splatter, further emphasizing the damage that you've done to it. Kindling. Kindling is a very unique feature. For the few of you who don't know, the amount of Estus you had wasn't controlled by Estus shards. If you were at a normal bonfire, you'd get 5, but if you were at a bonfire with a Firekeeper, you could get 10. Which kinda goes back into my area point, as this helps you emphasize your checkpoints throughout the world. But after you beat Pinwheel, you unlock the option to kindle bonfires, letting you sacrifice a humanity to boost your amount of Estus to a max of 20 for one bonfire. This may sound broken out of context, but in this game, it isn't so much that running out of Estus will be your problem. It'll more so be not getting melted in a matter of seconds due to some bad choices you made. So this will very rarely make a super huge game-changing difference unless you're running something like a tank build. And I feel like I have to slip this point somewhere in this video. The armor sets here look amazing. This point is subjective, so I'll try to keep it short, but they just look really good. All the way from the start where you're patching your armor together with what you can find, to the end of the game where you can select from anything, it's kind of a challenge to make your character look dumb by accident. And what I find interesting about this is quite a few of the unique sets in this game never left it somehow. Things like the Boar's helmet piece, Chester's armor, the crystal armor, etc. In this regard, this game is right under DS2 for me. Now we get into the more nuanced things. things. If you talk to most people about this game, they'll say Dark Souls is known for its absolutely amazing boss fights, with great designs and skillful combat. While I'll say DS1's bosses have the most unique designs in the series in my opinion, amazing boss fights is a stretch. For the time, I'd most likely agree. When FromSoft just released DS1, these bosses were way different from normal game or normal RPG bosses. They require a level of skill and commitment most other games don't, because they can kill you in a matter of seconds if you make a single mistake. Now we have two other main games to base the boss quality on. And if we extend even further to the other FromSoft games in general, we have tons of bosses to compare this to. And to be blunt, a majority of DS1 bosses aged poorly. Are they downright horrible? No, but to say they hold up against the other FromSoft bosses is a reach. In my personal opinion, many of them aren't really far off from Dark Souls 2. Here, most of them are clunky and can hardly turn around, with pretty easy to avoid attacks. On my replay of this game for this video, I first tried a majority of the bosses because even though I forgot their entire movesets, they aren't really challenging, to the point where a good chunk of them aren't even worth discussing. Now, are there unique encounters? Sure. This game has a few of them that deviate from your standard fight. Now, are all of them good? No, not really. Belfry gargoyles are neat. Their health was extremely low when I fought them with my knife, but I enjoy them. You've heard everyone gush about ONS, so I won't do the same. But in short, I think they may have the second or third best duo fighting FromSoft history. Only under Demon Princes and a little under Frida's second phase. But now for the bosses I have more extreme feelings towards, Nito is annoying. When you get him by himself, he's really easy. But his little respawning skeletons feel like they only exist to poke at you. And with the only way to permakill them being a holy weapon, something a majority of players won't just have on hand, it's this annoying game of killing the skeletons then hitting Nito in your free few seconds. In my replay of this game, I got annoyed enough by the skeletons to make a divine weapon to kill them. And when I did, I immediately shit on Nito for how simple his moveset is. Everyone's heard about how bad Bed of Chaos is, so I'm not gonna elaborate much, but yeah, stupid gimmick boss with insta-kill holes. Seath is aggravating for a few reasons. First, in his original encounter, you can't kill him at all. This isn't really communicated to the player. When I went through this game originally, I remember dying to him. Assumed I did the wrong thing since no one else in this game works like this, and I went back to his room to die again. After about 3 attempts, I just looked it up because I was about to cut the game off. You could argue, well, he's on a little bump and this should have been obvious. But you can also fight this boss after Bed of Chaos, which I feel is all I need to say. Then there's cutting his tail. Now, Seath is a wide fella. Getting behind him in itself is hard due to the fact he has 2 more tail-like things besides him. But disregarding that, you can only hit the tippy-tip end of his tail or else it won't come off. No other boss in this game works like this, and you'd have no reason to think of only hitting the end of it. I spent far more time on this replay than I'd like to admit trying to break his tail, because I didn't want to Google things. But then I eventually caved in. To say I was angry is a bit of an understatement. Then the fight itself, ignoring that, is interesting. Like I said earlier, if you try to go to his sides, due to his tail's ridiculous size and collision, you'll get body blocked by him constantly if you try to go anywhere but his front. Then if you are behind him, his tail swipes are nigh impossible to dodge unless you're really far from him, as he takes up about half of the arena. And then his tail's hitbox is something. I don't know if you guys saw the short I posted, but if we stick to focusing on his front, this fight is really easy. His moves are slow and just lead to a lot of scrambling away from him, then walking back and whacking him. He's not exactly what I'd call a riveting boss. Gwyn's fight is held together by chewed up gum and paper. I feel if you've played this game, we all know about parrying him to death. And the reason everyone does it is because it's significantly easier than fighting him regularly because he sharts out damage. If he hits you with a majority of his moveset, it does half health for 1 hit. Now this wouldn't be too much of a problem if he didn't have this one immediate slash move with no tell at all. I'm sure even the people who parry him to death know exactly what I'm talking about. The rest of his moveset is fairly standard, but this one move is so fast, sometimes it can chain off of his other moves and you have no way to evade it. And even if he does it raw, you have no way to react to this in time. It's the one thing that makes me feel like this fight was balanced by a child. The rest of it is pretty fair, and then it's immediately ruined by this one unfair move. Now for the DLC bosses. Priscilla's easy. She kind of fits into the same clump of forgettable and everything but design boss fights for me. But the Ulasil bosses, these are something else. Sanctuary Guardian on my first playthrough was easy with my strength build. I hardly remembered the fight, but on my replay, he was actually kind of fun. In my other Dark Souls videos, I've said for the first and second games, there's only 3 or so good bosses and they're both at the end of them. And honestly, I wish I included the Sanctuary Guardian in there. A majority of the bosses in this Ulasil area kind of match 3's boss fights. Fast, snappy encounters, and he fits that description. His damage feels fair as only his slower attacks do about half or more than half health. His combos become dodgeable after you get hit once, but you need to time it right or else he'll catch you. Overall, I think he's amazing. Artorias is kind of the same. Fun, fast, and unique. But there's one problem I have with him, and it's not really the fault of his moveset. You see, Artorias and more so Manus have high magic, lightning, and fire resist. As a Dex Faith build with a lightning infusion and Quilag's sword, I could practically deal no real damage to this boss. Ignoring the fact that there isn't any respec here, getting the resources to re-level my sword wasn't in the cards, so I just had to deal with it for him. I'm gonna dig a bit more into this later, but him being nigh immune to my build messed with my enjoyment of him. But everything else about him is great. He might even be the best boss in DS1 in my opinion. Now Manus is interesting. Manus again is like the others. Fun, fast, well-telegraphed attacks, decently sized openings, the works. Ignoring the whole nigh immune to magic and faith thing, since we just went over that, my only problem with his fight by itself is one move in particular, his combo. Now for the chunky shield fellas, I doubt this is a problem, but for lighter medium equipped characters, this is the bane of your existence. The tell for this move is him screaming for half of a second before flailing wildly around. Depending on how close you are to him, this will just outright kill you. If you're right up next to him, it's impossible to get away from this move in time, as the gap from him telling the move and him doing it aren't enough for you to get a safe distance. And similar to the Soul of Cinder in 3, if this move starts, it's a chain. The counterplay to this is to mostly hit things like his hand and not his body, as his hand is far enough away from him where you can run a safe distance if he tries to start this move. Which, while a fine counter in itself, I wish this move was tweaked just slightly so the tell was a bit longer. Even Gale's non-chaining flurry attack gives you more warning than this. Then there's Calamite. The boss I've heard is touted as one of the best, and some people told me I should have included him as one of the top bosses in my other Souls videos. I'll admit I hadn't fought Calamite until my replay for this review, and I was disappointed. Sure, it's a better fight than a majority of the bosses I beat first try, but I beat him in 2 tries. When I mentioned I was disappointed with him in my community tab, someone told me I have to think about how impactful it was for the time, which is true. But at the same time, now we have multiple dragon bosses, and he felt like the easiest out of the big 3 for me, with the other 2 being Sin and Medivh. Calamite's moveset is pretty limited and very easy to dodge. His damage isn't as high as Artorias or Manus even if you do mess up, and he just ended up not being that memorable to me. I didn't even get hit with his cool Calamity attack as I avoided it by accident. As I said, he's above average by DS1 standards, but in today's world, he's not much to speak about. But moving away from them individually, what else do all the bosses, even the ones I'm not going to be discussing here, have in common? Boss runbacks. And let me tell you, I don't enjoy any of them. They're all the right amount of distance to be irritating on your 3rd or so try. The few bosses I did have to redo didn't annoy me that much by themselves, but the minute or so walk back every time was brain numbing. Just inconvenient enough to be annoying. For a great example, I'd love to fight Gwen legitimately without parrying him to death, but that walk back has always made me reconsider every time I've played this game. I'm not even gonna sugarcoat it. A majority of my frustration with this game came from the enemies or enemy placement. The start of the game isn't so bad, as you're mostly fighting hollows. But once you reach Blighttown, Londo, and onwards, yeah, I was ready to snap my controller in half a few times. DS3 enemies for the most part don't matter. You can pretty much ignore them. DS2 enemies don't usually become a threat unless you get trapped in a scenario where you have to fight multiple of them at the same time. Their attacks were slow and obvious, and most of them didn't do much damage, so the only way they posed a threat to you is if you skipped a clump of them and then you got stuck in a group combo. Here, it feels like almost every enemy no matter what would hit me for half or more health. The Duke's Archives was a goddamn nightmare because of this. The little crystal guys are monsters. If you get hit twice and can't heal, you can get destroyed in moments. New Londo has ghosts that can flow through walls and have long arms. There were points where I was getting hit and I couldn't even tell where I was getting hit from. And again, that wouldn't be so bad if they weren't taking chunks of you every time they hit you. Some enemies like Dark Wraiths can combo you, but keep in mind, as I said before, you usually die in 2 or so hits, so they can just insta-kill you with this combo. Bone Wheels legitimately made me want to commit murder. I know it's a joke in the community how bad they are, so I won't harp on this point too much, but whoever made the cramped tunnel with the Bone Wheels and Aramis, I hope you stub your toe on your bed hard when you try to go to sleep. Same with the person who decided to put these 3 respawning demons in front of the giant blacksmith. And whoever made the Titanite demons, because fighting those things up close is a nightmare. Moving off of the enemies by themselves, there's just some overall irritating placement like I said before. Like the mice hidden in boxes near Gaping Dragon's area. Or the multiple times the game will just stick an enemy behind a corner you can't fully see. Now, are all the enemies annoying? No, of course not. But the cases where they are here happen to be really bad. Near the end of the game, I was so exhausted with the enemies, I legitimately almost stopped replaying the game and was going to do the rest of this review from memory. When people say the end half of this game drags more than the first, the enemies felt like the main reason for me. They're just so numerous and have so many half-health attacks. I died to them more than any of the bosses. And something I need to slip in before we move on is chain backstabs. See, the enemies here are so clunky when it comes to turning. If you get one backstab off, you can just run behind them and backstab them again. This straight up trivializes one-on-one encounters with certain enemies like the Silver Knights or Dark Wraiths. It's such a weird quirk in only this game, I felt I had to bring it up. Just a quick pause from the video for a moment. As a small YouTuber, if this video interests you in any way, shape, or form, a like and a subscribe would be very much appreciated. I'm trying to hit 1K by the end of the year, and you can help out with that. Anyways, back to the video. Now, hitboxes in Dark Souls have always been a bit divisive. DS2's hitboxes are infamous, and DS3's, while better and no one seems to mention them, do have a few issues as well. DS1 has a few problems with them too. I've seen quite a few things just go through me or someone else, but also a lot of times I felt like I get hit by something nowhere near me. This was mainly a problem in Duke's Archives. Then there'd be a good amount of times where the hitbox or collision of the creature is wider than it itself. So trying to run past some of those enemies, I get completely body blocked despite the fact it looks like I shouldn't be able to. Then there are lingering hitboxes, which are pretty tricky here. This seems to often be a problem with projectiles, I noticed. If you try and straight roll through them, which is pretty easy in the other games, you'll often get hit with the back end of the ability, which is a bit upsetting. Still not done with this point, there's a bit of hitbox shoving. It's a weird thing I've never really noticed in the other games, but with a lot of the stubbier or larger enemies, sometimes they'll do a turn and your character will be shoved in an entirely different spot. This is mostly a bed of chaos problem, but it happened to me a few times. Honestly, if you want a single enemy that embodies most of my problems with hitboxes and collision in this game, you could just fight a Titanite demon. Overall, hitboxes aren't a super prominent issue here, but it veered its head quite a few times during my playthrough. While in my DS2 and 3 videos, this didn't happen much. DS1 controls a lot like DS3, but a bit worse. Let me explain. DS1 controls are nice, smooth, and responsive, all up until you hit the little lock-on button. Then you can only roll in 4 directions. Even after trying to desperately think how this would make any sort of sense, I can't think of a single scenario where you'd want to do this. So I intentionally went out of my way to not use the lock-on except when I needed to aim miracles or something like that. Is this game ruining? No, not at all. As someone who played Monster Hunter, I don't really mind shifting the camera around to find the boss. That being said, it's such a weird problem only this game has. This is an interesting point, mainly because I never felt I had to do it before. I remember one time in my Elden Ring video, I said I never had to grind levels in Dark Souls, which is true. 3 and 2 I never needed to, and in 1 my first character was a pure strength girl with a club and power within, so I didn't feel the need to grind for anything at all. My weapon wasn't even maxed the first time I beat this game. Circling back to this playthrough though, I definitely needed to grind due to a few things I mentioned earlier, such as my weapons being useless against Manus and Artorias. Those fights forced me to undo my lightning weapon and level them normal, but I didn't have enough to max them. This, combined with the fact there isn't a merchant that sells you everything to max out your weapon, led to me grinding until I could get my weapon to plus 15, which wasn't necessarily a fun thing to do. And the worst part was, I didn't know Manus was immune to literally everything except basic damage types, since you're not really informed of what bosses are resistant to until you hit them. So I made an occult weapon that did near no damage to them, and had to reset that too before coming to the realization to make a normal plus 15. The second example I have with grinding in this game is with boss or special weapons. As I came into this replay pretty much blind, having forgot a lot of what I did in my first playthrough, I found 2 cool weapons I wanted to use. Quilag's sword and the Demon Spear. I wanted to use both of them, so I began leveling them simultaneously. Near the mid-game, I was confused on why I couldn't find any more Demon Titanite, and this was because, unknown to me, there isn't many of them in this game in general, or an enemy to kill to get more of them. Meaning at the point I was at, unless I googled all the locations and followed the guide to a T, those weapons just weren't going to be maxed in this playthrough. So after I got my plus 15 katana to fight against Manus, I just benched these weapons and didn't use them, despite the fact I really wanted to. And 2, I feel you're on level, if not over leveled with all your gear due to how much stuff this game shoves at you. And by the end of the game, you could buy all the Titanite resources you wanted in Marjula from Cloan. And 3, since it was so linear, finding the things needed to level wasn't so bad. And by the end game, just like 2, you could buy everything. It seems like this was a problem they fixed in the following titles, but it's interesting to see this kind of scenario could happen here. And just for 2 small additions. Dragon Scales. No idea why they insisted on making it so annoying to get these in 1 and 2, but since it's also used to upgrade some weapons in this game, I think it's a bit worse here. I'm kind of happy 3 just ditched the entire Covenant aspect of letting you turn into a dragon and pick up the transformations, because getting these, especially 50 of them, just isn't fun. The same thing goes for the Sunlight Medallions. As a Faith build, I'm sure you can assume I wanted a better lightning spear. here. But in this game, and only this game, it's locked behind Soul Layer's Covenant rewards for both variants. And if you don't want to play the game online, the only way to get them is to farm them from Chaos Bugs for a 3% drop. So as you can imagine, I just dealt with it and used the normal Lightning Spear the entire game. Usually this is where the complaint segment goes, but people don't tend to complain much about DS1 other than saying it's too hard, so I'm not aware of many of the more nuanced things people say about it. So in exchange for that, I'm gonna bring up things I couldn't fit into any other section. Embers. I found it annoying the way they hit embers, mainly the occult and large ones. I wouldn't mind if they were similar to the ashes in Dark Souls 3 that let the person you gave them to sell the resource, but for the simple feature of just leveling up your weapon to max? This is the main reason I never maxed out any of my weapons in my first playthrough. I legitimately never found either of these. I'm less mad about the occult ember seeing as it's not part of the main upgrade path, but hiding it down a well in a tunnel with bone wheels for a key, which you then need to use to open a door to fight more enemies, was unpleasant to say the least. NPCs. If you remember my other videos, I said the NPCs in 2 are mostly meh, except for a few, and in 3 they're all pretty good. In Dark Souls 1, it leads more to the DS2 side of things. Sure, we have Solaire, Quilina, Lautrec, and Segmire, but the rest are just kinda there. I can't really say I love the chunk of the NPCs this time around. And while this is a normal thing in FromSoft games, some of the character quests were just stupid. Solaire's kill all the maggots below or else he dies was one of the dumbest questline beats I've ever seen. I genuinely have no idea why you would do that regularly. The DLC is fairly obtuse to reach. In comparison to the other 2 games, I think it's insane how they figured you'd learn this. The worst examples of area unlocks in the previous games were most likely getting to Nameless King's area, which is a side area, so I don't particularly mind that, and DS2's DLC key, which is hidden on a cliff edge guarded by giants in a cave in one of the darkest areas of the game. This one, admittedly, is pretty bad. But then you look up the steps to reach this game's DLCs and it feels like you're performing a COD Easter egg. Explaining any of them would extend this video's length by a good few minutes. But to keep it short, I wasn't even sure Dark Souls Remastered came with the DLCs with how cryptic it was to get into any of them. There aren't any boss faith weapons at all. I think this is a real shame because DS1 has my favorite looking weapons in general out of all 3 games. But during the replay I did for this video, I could hardly use any of these interesting weapons because none of them scaled with the stats I had. My main saving grace was having Dex, as it feels like Faith was made for just miracle casting. Meanwhile, the literal opposite of my build, Intelligent Strength, gets something like the Moonlight Greatsword. Dark Souls 1 feels like the Dark Souls of Dark Souls games, if that makes sense. It's hard in nigh every aspect. Sometimes the word fair doesn't even feel applicable, but it works somehow. While I'm sure you've noticed I've had problems with parts of this game, there isn't a single aspect I can say was flat out done bad with little redeeming qualities. For everything I disliked about it, there was another part I did like. I dislike a good bit of the areas near the second half, but the first halves were really good. And even those second half areas I dislike, I found some parts of them genuinely interesting. I dislike some aspects about how the weapons were handled in this game, but those weapons in themselves are my favorite out of the trilogy. I don't care for most of the NPCs here, but Solaire is a literal icon. This is the most conflicted I feel I've felt about any game. It pissed me off multiple times during my replay. To the point when I beat it, I said I was never gonna play it again. But then I ended up playing a bit of New Game afterwards as a part of me just wanted a bit more of it. It just has this undeniable charm. Like, not all the pieces are perfectly in place, but it's close enough that they still fit. As I said at the end of my DS3 video, 2 shifted into the adventure aspect and 3 focused on combat. But 1 is this weird middle ground between both games. It does neither of what those games did as well as they did, but it's in this sweet in-between of combat and RPG mechanics. And I assume that's why people love this game so much and still cling on to it even after having 2 other games to play with. It does what it did so interestingly that it holds up pretty well on its own, even now. I'd still recommend people go back and give it a try, and I wouldn't be surprised if those people felt the same way as me, or just fell in love with it. Which is really interesting to say about a more than decade-old game with multiple derivatives, as I feel not many originals have the same sort of lasting power. While it's not my personal favorite, the love and critical acclaim Dark Souls 1 gets feels well-deserved. But regardless, what do you guys think? As always, as long as you're respectful, I'm glad to discuss with you in the comments, and I've been out, and I am out.